Hello, my Lacrypt keepers. I'm lucienlacrypt. Honestly, this video gives me such intense anxiety I thought about not doing it at all. So every few months on this channel, I end up doing a kind of raw video vlog that is essentially just me making a sad post. Usually when I make these kinds of videos, it's because I have something to say that I'm not going to be able to get out of my head unless I do a video on it. And somehow I've managed to make a career out of screaming into the void, so I guess I'll take advantage of that. As you probably guessed from the title, today I'm going to be talking about the relationship between me and my father. I'm going to do this for several reasons. Number one is that I want to examine how religion and propaganda play into politics, and to take a long, hard look at how evangelicalism has played into the rise of fascist ideology in America. So before I get into the real meat and potatoes of this issue, I should probably talk about Part 1, Evangelicalism and me. I have a personal relationship with evangelicalism, as well as the right-wing philosophies that went along with it. I grew up in the church, I went to Bible school, I watched VeggieTales, and while my experience with the church certainly wasn't a horror story like some people's, it certainly wasn't great either. I grew up in the Church of Christ in Christian Union, a more conservative branch of Methodists, but my father was raised deeply Baptist. At age 12, I came out of the closet as bisexual, and while neither of my parents really gave me grief for it, they seemed to think of it as a phase, something I would grow out of in time. And when I told my father, he told me, and I quote, "We all have those feelings, just keep them to yourself." And I remember thinking, no, Dad, we don't all have those feelings. Gay people have those feelings. Are you gay? But when I brought up the fact that my father might be gay to the adults in my life, they seemed to take it as some sort of insult, that I was lying to get a rise out of my family. My father responded with gaslighting and scorn. I began to question my own sanity and sense of identity. Then, after 20 years of marriage, my father came out as gay. And while I don't want to delve too deep into my parents' dirty laundry, I will say that they are in the process of a divorce, and my dad has yet to make a true apology to me. But one thing struck me as particularly strange. My father is still a conservative. He still voted for Trump in both elections. So I started asking myself, why? We spoke a little bit about false consciousness in my Antifa video. That one got me death threats. But this felt like more than false consciousness. Something much more insidious than blatant racism or bigotry. I'm not entirely sure if people outside Appalachia and the American South truly understand how deeply evangelicalism is laced into our politics and how damaging this particular brand of Christianity can be to relationships, families, and society. But in order to truly understand why evangelicals so often vote against their own interests, we first have to understand Part 2, the God Fandom. My father is part of an evangelical group called Pre-Millennial Dispensationalism. Part of the fundamental beliefs of this theology is something known as the rapture. The rapture is an end-time scenario where God summons the most devoted Christians to heaven and leaves everyone else on earth to face a period of tribulation, essentially the apocalypse. This belief system has been around for a while, but was really popularized through the Left Behind series by Jerry B. Jenkins and Tim LaHaye. Left Behind is essentially Bible fan fiction, and like a lot of fan fiction, it totally goes off the rails in some places. It's loosely based on the Book of Revelation, and by loosely, I mean very loosely. Ever read one of those fan fictions that are so divorced from the tone and meaning of the original text that it might as well be a completely separate work of fiction? Yeah, that's what Left Behind is. Unfortunately, a lot of Christians take this interpretation as the gospel. So what happens in Left Behind? Left Behind follows a group of people who remain on Earth after the rapture. The rapture is depicted as thousands of people across the globe simply disappearing in the blink of an eye, leaving behind nothing but their clothes. Those left behind are then subject to the whims of the Antichrist. And don't worry, we'll get to the Antichrist. They are also subject to the grief of losing their loved ones and essentially being told by the most powerful being in the universe that they suck too much to come to his party. And let me tell you, as a young child with abandonment issues, this fucked me up. To me, this was a nightmare, and it was enough to keep me on the straight and narrow, or at least somewhat attached to evangelical teachings, into my late teenage years. I was absolutely ruled by the fear of being left behind, and even contemplated suicide once or twice to avoid the possibility of being left alone on Earth with no parents or friends. There was just one problem. I was, scientifically speaking, super fucking gay. And being super fucking gay didn't really vibe well with the political aspects of premillennial dispensationalism. So it's time to discuss Part 3, the religious right. In order to talk about the religious right, we first need to talk about Israel. Now, look, I'm not here to have the Israel-Palestine debate. Honestly, I don't consider myself educated enough on that particular subject to hold a solid opinion. I'm only going to be discussing Israel in the context of premillennial dispensationalism and its effects on global policy. That's it. Please don't blow up my comment section. So, premillennial dispensationalists believe that the return of Israel to the Jewish people is a sign that the rapture is going to take place. They don't actually care about Jewish people, they just kind of see it as a means to an end for their prophecy. Because of this, they're willing to do pretty much anything possible to ensure their prophecy goes as planned, as is the will of God. Now, I'm not saying the creation of Israel caused this philosophy, but it certainly experienced an uptick in popularity. The Republican Party took notice of this voter bloc and exploited both the creation of Israel as well as the white fear around the growing civil rights movement to establish the Republican Party as the party of evangelical Christianity, and to renew their reputation as a party dedicated to ensuring the end times prophecy goes off without a hitch. Over time, more issues that led to evangelical unease were added to the Republican roster, like a hardline stance against abortion and opposition towards gay and transgender rights. They also engaged in anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant rhetoric and curtailed the rights of many marginalized groups. And while this all sounds like insane conspiratorial nonsense, it's important to understand that a good chunk of the population genuinely believes this bunk, including high-ranking government officials like Michelle Bachmann. And while she's no longer in office, her opinions still hold weight among voters, as well as other government officials. An important thing to remember is that people who genuinely believe in this theology are truly excited about the apocalypse. They believe in their hearts that one day God is going to suck them up into heaven to live in paradise forever. It ends up creating this really depressing and somewhat alarming ideology amongst believers that they're just waiting around on earth for the rapture. It's almost suicidal in nature. These are people who want to die. They want the world to end. And as for everyone else, well, bless their hearts. This is why so many evangelicals are also climate change deniers. They see climate change as part of this divine plan. Either it can't be real because God has already prophesied the way the world will end and that ain't it, or it is real and part of God's rapture plan, which means, oh boy, it's almost time to get sucked up into heaven. And that isn't even the weirdest shit. The weirdest shit by far is Part 4, the Antichrist. So let's discuss the Antichrist. This is the most easily recognizable takeaway from premillennial dispensationalism, as the figure of the Antichrist has been adopted into popular media depictions. However, the Antichrist in premillennial dispensationalism is much less Rosemary's Baby and much more... Okay, let's just be real here. It's just the Democrats. Because the Republican Party has solidified their commitment to the evangelical voting bloc, The religious right is absolutely convinced that the Antichrist will be a Democrat. And since voting for the Antichrist is a big no-no for ending up on God's VIP list, it is absolutely essential to premillennial dispensationalists to always vote Republican. You know, just in case. I grew up with my dad and great-grandmother talking about how Democratic politicians were the Antichrist my entire life, especially those that didn't fall into the perceived box of white Christian men. I remember them speaking of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton in horrifyingly racist and sexist terms. And while I'm not fans of either of those politicians for reasons too complicated to get into in this particular video, I remember being disgusted by them using their religion as justification for their bigoted beliefs. Bigotry is baked into this ideology, and any straying from Christian ideals by Republican politicians is seen as a means to an end, part of God's grand rapture plan, which is how we ended up with Part 5, the Trump prophecy. So, this is what everyone really came for, right? Because it seems absolutely bonkers that such a large percentage of the Christian voting bloc would vote for a serial adulterer with a long history of greed, corruption, rape, narcissism, and overall anti-Christian behavior. I mean, the man can't even name his favorite Bible verse. And while we've already discussed the party loyalism of the religious right, the story of how Trump became a major political candidate amongst evangelical Christians is wild. Strap in, folks, because this one's gonna be a doozy. In 2011, a former firefighter named Mark Taylor prophesied that Donald Trump would win the election and lead the religious right into a new golden era, which would prompt the second coming of Christ, and thus the rapture. Taylor, who had recently taken a sabbatical from the fire department due to PTSD, began having what he considered visions from God and the devil. Most of these symptoms are fairly consistent with PTSD nightmares and flashbacks, so I believe it's safe to assume that Taylor was experiencing symptoms of an advanced and untreated mental illness. During one of these episodes, Taylor fell asleep with the news on and heard Donald Trump's voice, which made him come to the conclusion that God is telling him Donald Trump needs to be president. And this is when things go completely off the rails, because instead of treating Taylor's mental illness, his extremely unprofessional Christian doctors played into his delusion, even going so far as to create prayer chains and horn-blowing rituals in order to see this prophecy through. And while Trump did not run in 2012, he did run and win in 2016, further cementing this delusion in not only the mind of Taylor, but in the minds of everyone touched by Taylor's prophecy. Right-wing Christian studio Liberty Entertainment even went so far as to make a movie about Taylor in 2018. Combine a bunk prophecy with a group notoriously known for bigotry and Republican Party loyalism, and you have a recipe for disaster. 81% of white evangelical voters voted for Trump, and it wasn't because Trump was a good Christian. It was because a long-standing propaganda campaign by the Republican Party and religious leaders convinced a large section of the population that they were the only way into heaven, that the only way to please God is through hateful, racist, and homophobic rhetoric. And if they didn't convince these people, they certainly gave them the justification for any bigoted beliefs they already had. Look, I understand that this video very well might be the thing that ends my relationship with my father, that after this, we may never be on speaking terms again. And it pisses me off to know that my father came out of the closet, and instead of backing up the queer community that has fought for years so he can live freely, he created a mental loophole that let him be one of the good ones while leaving the rest of his community out in the cold. But I'm not making this video to spite him. I'm making this video because so many people have been hurt by this religion. And recently, so many people have had their families torn apart because people they love care more about Donald Trump than they do their own wives, husbands, children, and grandchildren. And I want you to know that you're not alone in your pain. It's real. You're not just being dramatic, and you're not overreacting. And this is one demographic that honestly just stumps me, because you can't argue logic and reason with a belief system that is by its very nature illogical and unreasonable. And any time you try to argue for empathy, it's simply seen as the temptation of Satan or whatever. But if you are an evangelical questioning your belief system, especially if you're a young queer person, just know that the world outside of this box is beautiful. It's so much fun and full of loving, wonderful people. I can't convince you nothing bad will happen to you if you leave, but I promise one day you will find a community where you truly feel warm and loved. And to my dad, I am truly heartbroken that you chose to throw your community under the bus, that you chose to continue this destructive path instead of embracing a group of people who would have cared for you the way that you actually needed to be cared for as a gay man in America. And I hope this isn't the end. I hope you can come to me and talk to me about this like an adult, the way I've tried to talk to you countless times. But that's on you now. You need to come to me. No more excuses, no more lies, no more of this Christian martyr complex. Because you can be gay and Christian, but you can't be gay and an evangelical unless you're willing to do some serious mental gymnastics and throw a lot of people to the wolves. Mostly, Dad. I just wanted to say I love you. I love you, and I wish you the best. And most of all, I'm not sorry for anything. Are you?